Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeannie Gordon. I'd like to welcome you to this presentation by Dr. Uche Iloeje on NF clinical trials. Dr. Iloeje is the Vice President for Medical Affairs of SpringWorks Therapeutics, a biopharmaceutical company. He received his medical training in Nigeria and at the University of Pittsburgh, as well as Yale. He has 2 decades of experience in the pharmaceutical industry, and he enjoys working with patient organizations like the NF Network. He will educate us today on the clinical trial process and what is in the pipeline for NF patients. We are very grateful that he is sharing his knowledge with us this afternoon. Dr. Iloeje will leave time after his presentation to answer questions, so please leave them in the Q&A box, and that should be on the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to get to all of them. So during the next hour, I'd like to pass this on to Dr. Iloeje now.
Thank you so much, Jeannie, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the NF Central Plains and the NF Network for the opportunity to share about clinical trials and SpringWorks Therapeutics. So as Jeannie mentioned, I work for SpringWorks Therapeutics and I'm the Vice President for Medical Affairs. My company, SpringWorks Therapeutics, is a clinical stage targeted oncology company. And I'd like to spend just a little bit of time talking about my company before going into the topic for the day. SpringWorks Therapeutics has 2 late-stage rare oncology programs, which I will mention in a minute or so. And assuming that the data from those trials are strong, we should be in a position to potentially register 2 new therapeutics in rare oncology indications very soon. In addition to that, we have a broad program that is leveraging our 2 lead assets in collaboration with industry leaders to develop both of our drugs in different combinations for different oncology indications. And I'll spend a bit of time just explaining that to you in the next 2 slides. But the company is led by a very experienced management team. Being a very young company, we're literally about 2 years old, 2.5 years old as a company. The experience that our management team has is very deep and has put us in a very good position to be successful. In addition to that, we have been very fortunate to be a very well capitalized company, and that enables us to take our 2 lead programs to completion, as well as leverage technologies in partnerships with different companies. So here is our leadership team. Our CEO is Saki Bislam. He has experience from Moderna and Alexion prior to joining SpringWorks. Our Chief Medical Officer, who is my boss, is Jens Hanstrup, experience with Alexion and GlaxoSmithKline, amongst others. Badruddin Idris is our Chief Business Officer. Comes from a very strong background of consulting and healthcare consulting work as well. Frank Perrier is our Chief Financial Officer, deeply experienced from many other companies, and our Head of Clinical Research and Development is Mary Smith. And some of you may actually have either come across Mary in different engagements. Our board of directors is captured here at the bottom. I'm not going to go through them one by one, but again, it's a very deeply experienced board. Our pipeline is best understood in 3 distinct segments. The very first segment is what I spoke to a little bit earlier, our late-stage rare oncology indications. We have 2 lead assets, nirogacestat and MurderMetanib. Nirogacestat is being studied currently in a phase 3 study for patients with desmoid tumors, which is a really debilitating, locally aggressive, and really devastating tumor that significantly impacts patients' quality of life. We also have recently just announced a phase 2 study in pediatric patients in partnership with the Children's Oncology Group for nirogacestat. The MurderMetanib, which is our MEK inhibitor, is being developed for NF1 plexiform neurofibromas. I will spend a bit of time in this presentation describing both MurderMetanib and our phase 2b study. The second distinct segment that we are developing and we have 5 programs now announced in is our BCMA combination program, positioning nirogacestat essentially as a cornerstone for BCMA combinations across different modalities. We have to date 5 different joint venture partnerships in this particular opportunity segment. Then the third segment is a biomarker-defined metastatic oncology program. And the MurderMetanib, which is our MEK inhibitor, is actually being used in this particular segment in combination with lifirafenib, a RAS-RAF inhibitor, looking at opportunities in partnership with Beijing, which is a Chinese company. We have another asset here a little bit earlier on in development called BGB3245. So these are the 3 segments in which SpringWorks is actually very active in. In a nutshell, this is what our program looks like. So just to orient you to this slide, the deep blue are the programs with nirogacestat, which is a gamma secretase inhibitor. And the sort of teal color is the MurderMetanib containing programs. And then the green is the BGB3245 program. In the nirogacestat program segment, you can see that our lead indication, which is the adult study in desmoid tumors with nirogacestat as a monotherapy, is in phase 3 right now. And that study is called DeFi. That study has fully enrolled, and we're now accruing data. Once those data mature, we'll be able to share them. Then the pediatric study I just mentioned is a collaboration with a children's oncology group that is just getting off the ground. The different BCMA combination approaches right now are focused in patients with relapsed refractory multiple myeloma, and they are at different stages, but mostly in phase 1 right now. I will spend some more time on the ReNeu study, so I'm going to skip talking about it here, but the next study is the combination of our drug with lifirafenib, and that is looking at tumors with MAP kinase pathway aberrant solid tumors. So before going into any of SpringWorks programs, let me just spend some time walking you through understanding of clinical trials, and granted from the perspective of somebody that works in biopharmaceutical company. So what is a clinical trial? Essentially, as defined by the FDA, a clinical trial is a study or research project where humans participate either as patients or healthy volunteers to answer a set of questions about a drug candidate. And the whole idea is to look at treatment intervention or how disease affects people. The purpose of clinical trials is really to understand how we can advance science using any particular group of interventions, enhancing medical knowledge, and ultimately with the purpose of improving care for patients, and mostly patients in the future. One might ask the question, how are trials different from what would occur in everyday clinical practice? Well, the intent of a trial is really to answer a set of questions, new questions for which we don't have any current answer. Whereas the intent of medical practice is really to address the need of a specific individual patient. Who benefits from a clinical trial? As I mentioned in my previous slide, it's usually future patients. Obviously, the current patients who are enrolled in the trial do derive some benefit, but the primary beneficiary of the trial process will be patients in the future. Whereas in medical practice, the beneficiary is the individual patient who is sitting right there in a clinic before a particular clinician. The funding for clinical trial can come from corporate entities and companies like SpringWorks Therapeutics and others. also comes from universities and also comes from the government, for example, the NIH. Whereas the funding of medical practice is borne mostly by insurers, either public or private insurers, and in some cases, patients through co-pays, and in some cases, employers. A fundamental difference between the clinical trial and medical practice is in a clinical trial, it is a requirement to have informed consent. Because it's an experiment and it's uncertain what the interaction of the particular drug candidate would be in a particular patient, the informed consent is a requirement. Whereas in medical practice, it may or may not be required depending on what the medical intervention is. So for example, if you go into your physician's office to get a blood pressure check, you may not have to go through an informed consent process. But if you're going to get, even a flu shot or any intervention, a colonoscopy, an informed consent will most likely be required. So the informed consent is dependent on the procedure that you're experiencing in that medical practice setting. In terms of the assessment you receive as a participant in a clinical trial, these are pre-specified in a protocol. It is not really dependent on how the patient feels. So you might be feeling perfectly fine, but you will be required to go through the protocol specified assessment, and your clinician cannot deviate from that without the express permission of the entity sponsoring that particular clinical trial. In medical practice, if we practice medicine that way, it will be extremely wasteful and very expensive. So the assessments in medical practice are dependent on how the patient feels and what the patient complains about. So that's sort of a very big difference. In terms of protection for patients within the clinical trial setting, there's a very heavy presence from the federal government. As one might expect, the FDA is heavily involved in making sure that there's protection for participants in a clinical trial. And at any point in time, based on their observations and assessments, the FDA can stop a trial for safety reasons. The other entities involved in protecting patients include IRBs. There are professional standards that must be followed. There are legal standards, and as I've mentioned earlier, the informed consent provides a protection or a protective layer for the patient as well. When it comes to medical practice, it is very unusual for the federal government to be involved. These are guided mostly by state medical boards. And as with clinical trials, there's, there are professional standards, and there could be informed consent. There's also a peer review process in medical practice that also brings some protection to the patient. As I mentioned earlier, clinical trials are experiments by definition, so there is no certainty that benefit will be derived. It's expected, but the process of a trial is actually to try to prove that there is benefit for that particular intervention in a particular set of patients. Whereas in medical practice, typically you would only use products where benefit risk is proven. Now, there are exceptions to this. So for example, compassionate access to experimental therapeutics where benefit risk is not yet proven. But for the most part, you would only be experiencing in clinical practice medicines for which benefit risk is proven. In terms of the findings or observations from the trial, these are not released. These are released publicly, I'm sorry to say, they are released publicly. But that's very different from a medical practice where those observations are not released publicly because they are protected by a set of rules, including HIPAA. So your records are your records, and unless you give permission, they are not released publicly. So what are the phases of a clinical trial? Generally speaking, there are 4 phases, and there are deviations from this, but just as a broad set of rules, there are 4 phases of a clinical trial. So in the phase 1, this is usually the first time a drug candidate is introduced into humans. So this is typically the first in human study. And the questions asked here are fundamentally about trying to understand what the body does to the drug and what the drug does to the body. And at this very early stage, there's a very strong focus on understanding what the side effect profile of that particular drug candidate is, and essentially trying to also establish what is the dose beyond which the drug is no longer tolerable in a human being. And these are typically very small studies, and in most cases, use healthy volunteers. There are occasions where patients actually participate in phase 1 studies, and this is fairly common in oncology indications. Phase 2 studies, these are a little bit larger than the phase 1 study. And this is really the first time that we're looking at efficacy and safety at the same time, trying to understand the benefit as well as the safety, and trying to define the best dose of that particular compound in any indication that can then be taken into the phase 3 study. So you would often hear things like a recommended phase 2 dose, which would be the dose that will be tested, and then if proven to be efficacious and maybe not too unsafe and tolerable, that can then be taken forward into the phase 3 setting. The phase 3 setting is best thought of as a confirmation of your observations in phase 2, as well as a confirmation of the dose that you've selected to be a dose at which there is positive benefit risk. The population is often larger in a phase 3 study as compared to a phase 2 study, and these tend to be longer studies. The phase 4 study is often after you have received approval from the US FDA or the relevant regulatory authority in whatever jurisdiction that you might be in. And these studies are long-term surveillance and monitoring studies, often, and I'll speak a bit more to this on the next slide, often trying to identify a dead benefit, as well as trying to make sure that in a broader patient population that the benefit risk remains the same. So this slide is a little bit repetitive, but it puts the whole process in a picture. Starting from the left column and going across the slide in phase 1, typically very short duration studies, very, very few patients, as mentioned earlier. This is really about how the body processes the particular drug candidate and understanding what the real side effects of that particular drug candidate might be for the first time in humans. The phase 2 studies, as mentioned, a little bit longer, a few more patients. Still a safety question is being asked, but rather than asking the question of how the body handles the drug in terms of processing it, we're now asking the question, how well does that drug candidate compound work and how much of it should be taken? So trying to define the optimal dose that can then be taken forward into the confirmatory phase 3 study. And as mentioned, phase 3 is a little bit larger, seeks to confirm your phase 2 observations. And if the phase 3 is successful in the general process of drug development, that is when a company would file for approval with the regulatory authority, in this case, the US FDA. And the FDA would have a set timeline during which they will review the application. It can take anywhere from 6 to 12 months, depending on the type of application that this is. Then once approval is obtained, the drug candidate becomes available to the public for medical practice use. And then that is when you do a phase 4 study, trying to identify two very important things in phase 4 that may not have been answered to date. And that is, the first is, as I mentioned earlier, the phase 3 clinical trials, there are a lot of inclusion and exclusion criteria. And these are designed to select a population within which you can get as clear an answer as possible, and a population that will be able to actually complete your study. Once you go into medical practice, these controls are no longer there. So your study population is narrower, and in a sense, much more controlled than you would have in general medical practice. So it's really important in that setting to look for rare and new side effects. And that's a big focus of phase 4 studies, as well as also trying to understand how any particular drug candidate might compare to other drugs that are similar and that are being used in the same indication. So that's when you start looking at things like cost effectiveness or competitive effectiveness. So why would anyone consider participating in a clinical trial? As I mentioned earlier, the advancement of science and helping research, that is the real foundational purpose of clinical trials. So if that is important to you, that could be a reason. Another reason is simply trying to be helpful to current and future patients to make sure that new options become available to patients that you may not know for the most part. As I mentioned, through compassionate access, you can gain access to experimental medicines in clinical practice, but also in a clinical trial setting. By participating in this trial, you're also gaining access to experimental medicine. And this can actually be quite important in the care of patients, especially in oncology, where clinical trials are essentially, in a very practical way, part of medical practice in a way. But bear in mind that if you are in a clinical trial, these are experimental products. So there will be risks involved, as the benefit risk of these compounds are not fully understood. Hence the need for a proper informed consent. And this should address the risks very clearly. So you should always speak to your physicians to learn about the risks and benefits of any trials that you might be contemplating becoming part of. If you then decide and you choose to become part of a trial, you must provide an explicit informed consent, and the known risks and benefits of the particular compound that is being tested must be explained to you. Bear in mind that depending on the type of study, you may be receiving an active treatment or you may be getting a sugar pill. It is very possible that as a patient, if you have been told what the potential side effects of any particular drug is, if you then participate in that trial and begin to experience those side effects, you can actually guess if you're getting the drug candidate or a sugar pill. That is okay, but don't ask your clinician because they will not tell you or confirm your suspicions, right? So, and that's a very important point, because for studies for which there is an active comparator, it is really important that patients not know and clinicians not know for a fact what the patient is getting, but because that can introduce a lot of bias into the study itself, and that would often negate the study. So it's very important to maintain that blinding in a trial. So even if you suspect that you're taking the real drug candidate, please don't seek to confirm that, because that will be a challenge in of itself for the trial. So throughout the study duration, your medical team must monitor your safety, especially your safety. They have to monitor you constantly, I meant to say. If any serious or unexpected adverse events occur, that could be a reason for you to stop participation in the trial. Okay. Now, as a patient, you always retain the right to change your mind at any time and stop participating in a trial, even though we don't advise it. But that right is yours, and you may choose at any time to exercise that right, and you frankly don't have to justify your decision to anybody. Pay attention to the trial duration. Some trials can be very short, 3 months, some can be as long as 5 years. It is really important that you understand the duration and that you're reasonably certain that you can commit to that duration before signing on. Otherwise, as a trial sponsor, we will be faced with a situation where a lot of patients might discontinue from the study, and that would decrease the power or the ability of the study to actually answer the question that was set out to be answered. So it's really important to understand the study duration and be certain within yourselves that you can actually commit to that duration. Any costs that are part of a trial are typically borne by the company or the entity sponsoring the study and are not borne by you or by your insurer. So anything that is specified in the protocol as a procedure or a test, those costs go directly to whomever is sponsoring that particular trial. However, if your provider, as sometimes occurs and actually frequently occurs, if your provider orders any tests or procedures that are outside the protocol, those will generally be borne by your insurer and by you, depending on the type of insurance you have. As a sponsor of a study, it is really unethical to pay participants to participate in a trial, but understandable nominal stipends can be provided to cover cost of transportation to and from the clinical trial site. As far as the results from your participation go, your personal results in a trial will often be provided to you, but the results of the trial as a whole will not be shared with you until the trial is made public after its conclusion. So let me spend just a few minutes talking about SpringWorks trial in NF1 patients with plexiform neurofibromas. This is a trial that we call RENEW. It's a phase 2b trial, and our MEK inhibitor is called MurderMetanib. This trial, as I mentioned, is now ongoing, and I will share a bit more in a little bit. But before doing that, just a word on plexiform neurofibromas. Many of you probably know what this is. Some of you are probably patients and you've experienced this. But just from a very top line summary point of view, plexiform neurofibromas can be painful, disfiguring tumors, and they grow along your peripheral nerve sheaths. The NF1 gene controls production of a protein called neurofibromin. Mutations in that gene will lead to loss of neurofibromin, which then leads to uncontrolled cell proliferation and increasing the risk of different tumors growing across the body, not just plexiforms. So the NF1 gene is actually relevant in many tumor types beyond plexiform neurofibromas. On the right-hand side of the slide, I've just shown a very simple depiction to show that neurofibromas can be cutaneous, and the cutaneous form is quite prevalent. NF1 patients have a 90% or greater lifetime risk of developing a cutaneous neurofibroma. The plexiform neurofibromas, as I mentioned, are quite disfiguring, quite painful, and NF1 patients have between a 30 and a 50% lifetime risk of developing these plexiform neurofibromas. If you have a plexiform neurofibroma, I know that earlier today, Dr. Angela Irby spoke about MPNSTs. Well, MPNSTs are the malignant transformations that can occur in plexiform neurofibromas, and there's an 8 to 15% lifetime risk of actually developing MPNST if you have a plexiform neurofibroma. And MPNST diagnosis carries with it a 50% 12-month survival. So it's a very aggressive type of malignancy and quite poor outcome for the patients. As a whole, MEK inhibitors have become the cornerstone and validated as a very important tool for the treatment of NF1 plexiform neurofibromas. What about MurderMetanib? As I mentioned, it's a MEK inhibitor. It's an oral small molecule MEK inhibitor. It's been tried in over 200 patients, so it's been exposed to a lot of patients prior to us starting the RENEW study. We do have encouraging results, which I'm going to share with you on the next slide, from a phase 2 investigator-initiated trial. And what that means is that study was started independent of SpringWorks, so we had no role in either initiating or designing or executing that study. But I'll share those results with you because we have them. MurderMetanib as a drug candidate has received orphan drug designation from the US FDA and the European Commission. And we also have a fast track designation at the US FDA, which means that at the end of our study, if the results are positive, the FDA is going to accelerate the review of our filing package. We believe that a potency of MurderMetanib combined with the optimized dosing schedule, which I'll speak to in the next slide, make this potentially a very differentiated MEK inhibitor from other current MEK inhibitors. The ReNeu study is currently enrolling, and we expect to have an update on that study status very soon. I mentioned the results from an existing phase 2 study. Well, this is the study. It was run by the NF Consortium. The lead investigator was Dr. Brian Weiss from the University of Cincinnati. That study was run in 19 adolescents and young adults, ages 16 to 39, with a median age of 24. The dose that was used in that study was 2 milligrams per meter square, up to 4 milligrams twice a day, with an intermittent dosing schedule of 3 weeks on and 1 week of a drug holiday in every cycle. So each cycle is 4 weeks. You get the active treatment for 3 weeks, and then for 1 week, there is a dosing holiday. In that study, 8 of the 19 patients, which is 42%, reported and were confirmed to have a greater than or a 20% reduction in tumor volume by COS12, and that was the primary outcome of the study. So 42% of the patients in that study responded to MurderMetanib, as compared to 4.1%, which might be expected based on age-matched historical controls. And to be clear, these are not patients that were part of that study, but this is what will be expected of an age-matched control absent active treatment. In terms of tolerability, there were 5 dose reductions in that particular study, all due to grade 2 events. 2 were from rash, 1 nausea, 1 fatigue, and 1 pain. In terms of adverse events, there were treatment emergent. In other words, they occurred after treatment started and of grade 3 severity. There were 7 events reported in 5 patients, so multiple events in some patients. Only 2 events, and both of them occurring in the same patient, and that was pain, was considered to be treatment related. So the other events were considered by the investigator not to be treatment related. And we believe that the dose that we've chosen and the schedule of 3 weeks on and 1 week off were very instrumental in minimizing the historical class toxicities, especially the skin rash, that have been very well described with MEK inhibitors as a class. So here's the design of the ReNeu study, a fairly complex slide, but I'll make it very simple. To participate in the study, you have to be 2 years or older, and you have to have NF1, plexiform neurofibroma, that's causing you significant morbidity. And I'll explain what that means in a little bit. We are seeking to enroll into 2 strata. The first stratum is a pediatric stratum for patients aged 2 to 17 years of age, and we're looking to enroll 50 patients in this stratum. The second stratum is an adult stratum for people aged 18 years and over, again seeking to enroll 50 patients. So if we're successful, we're looking for 100 patients in total. The treatment will be the same dose that was used in the previously reported phase 2 study from the NF Consortium of 2 milligrams per meter squared twice a day with a maximum dose of 4 milligrams twice a day. The treatment regimen will be the same. The cycle will be 3 weeks on and 1 week off, and patients will receive a total of 24 cycles, following which there will be long-term follow-up for safety. The primary endpoint is overall response, which is a combination of either complete response or a partial response. And a partial response is defined just as it was in the phase 2 study as a 20% or greater reduction in tumor volume by MRI. The key secondary endpoints are safety and tolerability. We'll be looking at duration of response. So if you respond, how long does that response remain? And we're also looking at quality of life. A very important aspect of this trial is we do have both a capsule and a disintegrating tablet form for patients who might not be able to swallow, either because of the location of their tumor or because they're very young. So if you're wondering if you're eligible for the study, well, here are some of the things that you have to keep in mind. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, you have to have NF1 and have a plexiform that causes you significant morbidity, and that includes the fact that it cannot be completely surgically removed. It has a negative effect on your quality of life, either trouble with locomotion and functional limitations, severe pain, or severe disfigurement. You have to be 2 years or older. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a capsule. And if you can't swallow, there's a disposable tablet. Now, bear in mind that I have significantly simplified the inclusion criteria just for the purposes of this presentation. If you're interested in participating, your clinician will be able to discuss the full inclusion criteria with you, and I'll tell you how to get access to the protocol. Now, not everybody who wants to participate can participate. We have exclusion criteria. So what could make one ineligible? If you have abnormal liver function or a history of liver disease, that could be a problem. If you have a lymphoma, a leukemia, or any malignancy in the past 5 years, with the exception of minor, non-complicated skin cancers, that could be a problem of itself. If you have breast cancer in the past 10 years, probably won't be able to participate in the study. If you have active optic glioma or other low-grade glioma requiring treatment, you will be excluded. And you might wonder why. Well, this drug candidate, MurderMetanib, has not been approved for these patients, and frankly, no MEK inhibitor has. But the point is, for patients who need treatment, we don't know how this drug would work, so we will not be wanting them to stay in the trial for that reason. If you have abnormal heart function or you have an abnormal heart rhythm, that can be an exclusion because MEK inhibitors as a class have been documented in the past to have a negative impact on your cardiac function in some patients. Patients with a history of retinal disease or risk factors for retinal vein occlusion or a history of glaucoma will be excluded. Again, as a class, MEK inhibitors have historically at much higher doses, not at the doses we're using in this program, but at much higher doses, have been documented to actually cause problems with the eye that can lead to vision loss. If you're unable to absorb the drug because you have a malabsorption syndrome or you have a problem in your gastrointestinal tract, that would exclude you from participation as well. If you've received any targeted treatment for a plexiform, or if you've actually been exposed to MEK inhibitors, that would also be exclusionary. And if you've received radiation treatment in the past 6 months as well. Again, just like the inclusion criteria, you would need to discuss with your physician and carefully go through all the inclusion and exclusion criteria if you're contemplating participating in the study. If you become part of a trial, following your initial evaluation and you start taking study drug, you'll be required to come back for a clinical visit every month for the first 7 months and every other month thereafter till study conclusion, which will be 2 years from your first dose of study treatment. At each visit, you will have routine physical examination. You will have a review of your vital signs. You undergo study procedures, including completing quality of life questionnaires, including doing having an MRI done to measure the tumor volume and also have an assessment of your physical function. There may be additional tests that will be required based on where your tumor is located as well. And as I mentioned, again, your clinical trial site, which will be your investigator and the trial team, will be able to discuss the trial procedures in more details with you. So if you are interested in getting additional resources about the ReNeu trial because you're interested in participating, please speak to your physician, and your physician or you can go to www.springworkstx.com to get additional information on the trial. And you can also go to clinicaltrials.gov, and here's the NCT number as well, to pull down the public version of the actual protocol for the ReNew study. For additional information on clinical trials in general, you can go to also clinicaltrials.gov or to the NIH website, and there are plenty of materials there for patients or clinicians to actually take advantage of. So before concluding my talk, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes just speaking about SpringWorks and the NF network. I know that this program is co-sponsored by NF Central Plains and the NF network. And when I speak about the NF network, I'm actually referring to the whole family of the NF network, including all the alliance organizations. You know, it was about a year ago that I reached out to Kim Bishop to begin to explore a relationship with the NF network. And at that time, we identified 5 potential areas where we could have joint interest. In some of those areas, we've done some things. In some, we are yet to do things. But it's really exciting for me to be here today to share about the work that SpringWorks is doing. In terms of what we've actually been able to accomplish working with the NF network, you know, everything we're trying to do is really to try to improve care for patients. That is a fundamental a goal. The work we've done so far since the past 10, 11 months or so, we've actually developed a brochure on understanding clinical trials for patients. For those of you who enrolled and signed up for this webinar, you should have received a copy in the mail. And if you haven't, I'm sure it will be sent to you by the NF Network or NF Central Plains. And you can also just reach out and ask for it. We are collaborating with the NF Network on getting the word out about our ReNew clinical trial. As a company, SpringWorks is really proud to have been a dream sponsor for the 2020 NF Hope concert. Just a plug for this, I know that Jeff will be very happy I did this. I think the next event is on October 18th. You know, SpringWorks is a dream sponsor, and we're really proud of that partnership. Finally, we have just recently supported the NF Midwest 2020 work that wasn't. So in a very short time frame, I think we've been able to do things that I believe and I hope really work towards that fundamental goal of advancing patient care. Here's just a snapshot of the brochure I spoke about. It will be sent to you if it hasn't been already. Before concluding, just a very big thank you. A very big thank you to, to all of you for taking time to listen to this webinar, but especially to patients who make time to volunteer in clinical trials. It's a big sacrifice. It takes you away from other things you could be doing. And you certainly don't have a certain expectation of benefit because you're in a trial setting. So really appreciate the time and the sacrifice that you make. I also want to thank all the clinician scientists and staff at the different sites that dedicate their lives to clinical trial execution, not just for SpringWorks, but for clinical trials in general. I think it's a very, very important component of making sure that new chemical entities are properly tested before they're released very broadly into clinical practice to help patients. Before a new chemical entity can actually be tested in a trial, it has to actually be designed, discovered, and developed. So the scientists at different research institutes, the NIH, academia, private sector companies like SpringWorks Therapeutics and others like it that discover and develop new chemical entities, a big thank you to you. But finally, to patient organizations. The NF Network is a very special organization. I've been working with Kim and the team now for about a year, as I mentioned. SpringWorks as a whole has been really impressed with the work that you do, supporting patient needs, supporting research. You're helping us in a very patient-centric way as we try to develop MurderMetanib for patients with NF1 plexiform neurofibromas. Your advocacy on the Hill for funding and policies that advance the cause of NF, I think, speak for themselves. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity. And if you need to speak or to email me after this, here's my email address. And at this point, I'll take some questions. And Brianna, I don't know if there are questions in the Q&A inbox.
Yes, we do have quite a few questions that are sitting here, but first we would like to say thank you, Uche, for giving such a special presentation today and for giving, all of this insight and information to our NF community. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work alongside SpringWorks as well in this. So thank you very much. If you're ready, I can read the questions to you or you can view them yourself.
So I can actually read the questions here.
Fantastic.
Maybe if yes, I see 3 questions, and I hope that covers. So the first one is, and I hope I don't say this name wrongly. Lannis asks, how can I sign up? I think Lannis, if you mean how can you sign up for the trial, the website that I put up, you can go to. Well, first of all, you got to talk to your physician, right, and express an interest in participating in the trial. And then you can direct your clinician to the website. It will be www.clinicaltrials.gov, and you can he or she can pull down the protocol and evaluate whether you can be a study participant. Now, you have to be at a center that already has a trial opened up. So if your clinician is not practicing at a center that has a trial open, you can reach out to us at SpringWorks and we can put you in touch with the center that is nearest to you. And you can reach us through my email address, just to make it easy for you. And that was the email I put up on the last slide. The next question is a ReNeu study double-blind or every patient receives medication? A really important question, and I did not really make this clear. The ReNeu study is an open label, which means that every patient will receive the active medication. So a really important question. So thanks for giving me a chance to clarify that. The next question is, what does a MEK inhibitor do to every other cell in the body? It's a very complex question, and it's one that I'm very sure that I will not be able to do justice because the MAPK pathway, as I mentioned, is present in multiple cells in the body, and the studies that are looking at MEK inhibitors in multiple different tumor types is an indication that this pathway is relevant for tumors in multiple different cell lines. So it's a very difficult question to answer in the context of a presentation like this, but I think this came from Sharon. So Sharon, we can actually discuss this offline, and I can provide you more specific answers or point you in the right direction. But I will not be able to do this justice in this platform. So can you put your email in the chat? I absolutely will do that. Or Brianna, I'm actually very comfortable sending my email to everyone that registered for this section. Can you do that for me?
Absolutely, I can do that.
Excellent. I think that will solve that. And then the last one here is, as far as trials go along, since my son is an adolescent, is it up to him or is it up to me as his parent? That's a really good question. I think, the age of consent is adulthood. So if he's not yet achieved adulthood, I think obviously as a parent, you would have to be the one to consent your child. I'm also cognizant of the fact, I think all of you probably know this, that NF1 as a syndrome impacts cognition as well. So it's very important in the informed consent process to be cognizant of the manifestations of the NF1 in any particular individual. So even if that person is an adult, the person may or may not be able to provide consent for themselves, depending on an assessment of how the disease is impacting their cognition. So a very good question. Okay, so there were 5 questions. I think I've addressed them all. And I think we do have some time for any other live questions.
Yep, I believe the questions that are there, those are the questions that we have remaining. A couple more people were asking for your contact information, which I have posted in the chat. Let me double check here.
Okay, I'm looking in the chat as well.
Fantastic. It looks like Sharon was making a comment that the
Yeah.
scientific question was from her husband. So,
Yep. Okay, and I'll follow up. I see the husband emailed here. So Brianna, if you can save the chat and the questions for me and just send them over, I'll follow up with the husband through his email later on.
fantastic. I will make
Okay.
sure to save both of them for you. If there, it looks like we might have one last question at the bottom here from Marie.
Yes. So how do I know out of all the fibroma which one will be benign or not? So actually there's one more that came in as well. Do you have to have an NF clinic to refer you for the trials? Okay, so let me take the first one. So the word benign, I think it's understood very clearly to mean without metastatic potential. In other words, it's not a cancer that metastasizes. But the word benign can also be misunderstood to mean, not serious. I think that's an unfortunate potential misinterpretation for that word. So plexiform neurofibromas, especially the ones that we are addressing in our trial and other MEK inhibitor trials, yes, they are not cancers, so they don't metastasize, but they are quite debilitating. So they are very serious conditions. So I don't know the context of this question, but if you're asking the question around which of them is a cancer or which is a malignant condition versus not, then I will tell you that plexiform neurofibromas are not cancers. They are tumors, but they're not cancers. The dermal fibromas are not cancers. The MPNSTs are cancers. They are malignant transformations that occur in patients who have plexiform neurofibromas. So I hope that clarifies that. But benign, I think, can oftentimes be misinterpreted to mean non-serious. I think that will be a mistake, because if you meet a patient with these conditions, you can't describe a plexiform that is symptomatic as non-serious. They're quite serious, and they severely impact quality of life. In terms of the last question, do you have to have an NF clinic refer you for the trials? I mean, the answer is frankly no. You have to have a center that has an NF clinician, right? So, NF clinics typically are those centers where most of the patients go to. So practically speaking, you probably have to have an NF clinic, because it's difficult to find NF patients outside of NF clinics. And our trials are in centers with NF expertise. But your clinician can be just a primary care physician referring you to a trial site. And all doctors can have access to the protocol through the clinicaltrials.gov website. Two more questions. Oh, just an explanation. Okay, so from the question about the benign fibromas, he just had a plexiform removed and they said it was benign. So how are they so sure? Well, there must, I hope that, and I suspect that they've taken the tumor and gone to histopathology and looked at it and confirmed that there is no malignant portion of it, which is what you would typically see either as a malignant transformation. So if they've removed the tumor and they've done pathology and they've given you a diagnosis that is not a cancer, I think, again, I'm not licensed to give you medical advice, but if you're not sure, you can always ask for a review. But for the most part, plexiforms, as I mentioned earlier, are not cancers. Okay. So one more question here. There's no formal NF clinic in this particular location. Yes, so oncologists, neuro-oncologists also care for patients with NF, with plexiforms and NF in general. So I can see where an oncologist might be also the right person. But for the purposes of a trial, you would have to be at a center where a trial exists. And for the most part, our trial will be in a place with, either an NF clinic or a neuro-oncologist who differentially specializes in the care of NF patients. Okay. The questions are coming in. Okay, one more question. What happens if you don't reach your goal of 100 people? Is there a minimum number you need to proceed? I mean, I'm very optimistic that we'll reach that number, but obviously we're not there yet. So we will look at, every study is powered to show a particular effect, and when companies or anybody typically designs studies, we always make allowance for people discontinuing. So even if we say a target of 100, within that is a slight buffer, taking into account discontinuations and making sure that even with discontinuation of a certain number, we'll still retain enough power. So it depends on where we eventually net out in terms of the final number. But I'm quite optimistic. We're working very hard to make sure that we'll reach our target number of 100. Okay. I'm still searching. One more came in. My son goes to Johns Hopkins. In their clinic, should I ask them? They have a neurocutaneous team. If this is a question about asking for your son to participate as a potential patient in the RENEW trial, you could ask them, but I'm pretty certain that Johns Hopkins is not a current site. We'd have to look at clinicaltrial.gov to confirm that, but I'm pretty certain not a site. But they can refer your son to a trial site, and all the sites that we currently have will be found on clinicaltrials.gov. So we have a listing of the active sites there. So you might want to start there first, identify the site. If Johns Hopkins is not a site, find the closest site in terms of proximity, and then discuss that with the clinical team. Okay. And I really appreciate Sharon's comment, and this is why I love working with the NF Network. You work hard to publicize the trial and help with patient awareness. Really appreciate it. I think this trial is there for patients, right? So the sooner we get it enrolled, I think the sooner we'll have results and the answers to our questions. So thank you for that, Sharon. Do you realize how many NF patients don't have access to a clinic? Do you offer any help in getting patients to the NF clinic? As a company, we would not ordinarily do this for clinical practice, but if the question is as it relates to access to a clinical trial site, and the answer is yes, we will help put you in touch with the trial site closest to you geographically. But if the question, Julie, is about clinical practice, I think the NF network may actually be a better resource to make connections to actual NF clinics, better than SpringWorks could ever be in that regard. So if it's for trial, yes. If it's for clinical practice, I'd suggest maybe the NF network itself could be a better help for you.
Yes, thank you very much, Uche. Anyone with questions about clinics or finding NF physicians near you, please do not hesitate to reach out to the NF network. I have listed both the website and the email in the chat box. So please be sure to check those out and get in touch with us. I think that is about it as far as our questions go. I want to take another second to say thank you very much to Uche for giving this presentation and sharing this information with our NF community. We do have 2 more presentations to wrap up our day today. We have a presentation at 2:15 with Dr. Panosian, who will give a presentation on electrodesiccation. And then we will have a parent panel that will be running at the same time. That is going to be hosted by Dr. Keely Fitzgerald. So we hope to see you on one of those last 2 presentations. And once again, thank you so much, Uche, for sharing this information with us.
My pleasure, and good luck. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you.